Hey friends, welcome. We are here doing the CCD Facilitation Practicum course. I have our good friends Kendra and Daniela with me. I am Jamie Monday. So let's get into it. We're going to be talking today about facilitation of community center development. And really, this is kind of built on our principles course, and which I assume you've probably already done if you're here. And we're going to kind of introduce it a little bit today, talking about process. It's a bit of an overview. We're going to talk about what it means to be a facilitator and also what to expect in terms of the process. The principles are really about the theory. And so we've been addressing a sort of a paradigm of how we approach community centered development. And now we're moving towards practice. And so principles are really the why, and we're going to be talking about the how. And so in order for this to really be relevant, we need to be engaged at the community level. And so it's a matter of really getting out of our chair and getting into the community, talking to people, hearing stories, and trying different things. And we're going to expect failure as well, and different iterations, and trying things differently. And that's really the CCD process. It's not a direct road. You're going to learn practical tools and exercises to help communities discover what they have and then mobilize for change. So we want to start with a bit of a review. And so we're going to just talk about, well, what is CCD, community centered development? When I was younger, I worked in the inner city, serving the poor, and I was really led by a desire to serve, and I sort of a spirit of serving and compassion. And I think probably a lot of you are the same way in terms of your motivation that kind of got you into the ministry of the service, and doing development work, whatever it is exactly that you do. And all around me, I saw sad, needy, powerless people, and I wanted to help. But as I think back, I realized I was kind of blind to who these poor people really were, the gifts and the ideas that God had given them, and even the possibility that they could be a part of the change process. And so at its core, CCD is really about perspective. It's about a changed perspective. Um, I'm going to just change the slide here. And we're going to look at these two different ideas: a traditional community development model, which you're probably familiar with or even participated in, and the community center development model. And so what I was talking about is a community focus. What is the focal point of that person that comes from outside of the community? Well, you're looking at needs and problems and deficiencies. Um, but as you can see here, in a community centered model, it's about people, it's about relationships, it's about community building, asset discovery, and community connections. What are you trying to achieve ultimately? Like, what's the objective? Now think about that in a traditional model, and maybe it's a product of working with um, different funders or agencies. Maybe you're part of an NGO. You want successful project outcomes. On the other hand, community-centered development, um, you're interested in long-term and sustainable impact. Ultimately, it's about transformed people. And when people are transformed in their mentality, it's about communities that are functional. They're able to function on their own, function interdependently, collaboratively, working towards long-term and sustainable impact. Impact that, by the way, is not dependent on you. It's not dependent on the funder. It's not dependent on ongoing intervention, but they're able to achieve that on their own. So really, you don't know how successful you've been for quite some time. So what's the role of the community members in the process? In the traditional model, they're beneficiaries, right? They're recipients of other people's compassion and care. Often they're seen as clients, or even consumers. In the community center development model, they're needed citizens. So the function of the community actually depends on them. And just think about how empowering that is to someone who thinks, oh, wait, my community actually needs me. So that's the mentality that we want to help to facilitate in people. They're co-creators. They can't do it on their own. But we get into this mentality of, if we can come together, we can create change together. We can produce things, right? The opposite of being a consumer. We are producers, and they are change agents. So we're trying to give people agency, an all important word that means they have the ability to make change, really. So where does the power come from? Does it come from outside the community, external materials, expertise, money? No, it comes from inside the community. So again, it's people with a transformed mindset, and then they have the courage to come together and start with what they have. So that's where the power comes from. So for you as a facilitator, if you really recognize that and understand that, it really helps you to take on um, the right characteristics, the right mindset as a facilitator, because you're trying to draw something out of there, out of the community itself, in terms of the power for change. And so the next one is structure. And it's important for us to think about, because we're actually talking about process. Normally, if you're part of a NGO or even a church that's engaged in the community, and you're saying, okay, well, what's the process? Well, let's get some funds together and let's come up with a plan, and then let's mobilize some people, and they're going to go out, and here's the phases of the project. So that's what we're talking about with structure. So traditionally, it's staff-led programs, it's more service-oriented, organization-led, and sometimes funding can determine the activities as opposed to the other way around, right? Oh, there's some funds available, let's do that. And so from our perspective, doing CCD, we start from the grassroots. We start with what's there. Community passions determine activities. So we're not starting with great ideas from outside, but what is happening in the community already? What are people already on about? And sometimes it takes some real turning over of rocks to see what's there and find out what are people passionate about. And it's facilitation oriented, not service oriented, citizen led versus organization led. What about leadership? Um, it's certainly not top down. And traditionally, in a community, there's going to be staff or the village chief, what have you. Leaders make the important decisions, and it's often based on status. And so, of course, we're leaving out women and younger people, and often people that don't have the same amount of status, but have an incredible contribution to make to the community. We miss out on all of that. And so we need to recognize the leadership needs to be flat and kind of a democratic process. And sometimes this works against the culture that you're in. And you may be laughing right now. It's easy for you to say, Jamie, like this culture that we live in, it's really difficult to invite leaders to kind of get off of the throne and hear the ideas and receive the gifts and the assets and the talents and abilities of all the people in the community. And so that takes some time and effort, and often you're swimming upstream in that respect, moving into more of a democratic approach to leadership. So ultimately, the guiding question here, when we talk about this a lot, is what do you have? What's here? What do you care about? What's important in this community? What are you already doing is a guiding question. And so we're moving away from this mentality of what is the problem here and what do you need? And so moving on from that, let's talk about the process. Course is broken down into these 3 parts we talk about quite a bit: discover, connect, and mobilize. And most of the time we're going to spend on discover. It doesn't make it any more important than the other 3, but I want you to think about this a little bit as a 3-stranded rope. Okay, so there's 3 strands and they're twisted together. You know how it is. And they overlap somewhat, right? So this is not a perfectly sequenced process. Oh, we finish one up very tidy, and then we're going to move on to the next one, connect. In reality, as you work with a community, these things are kind of overlapping and functioning together. But for the sake of learning and understanding it, we're going to kind of separate them out a little bit. And so Discover is really the starting point for CCD. And you think about yourself going in there with a giant spotlight, and you're going to shine it onto the community. People, their powerful stories, physical, natural assets, and all of the social networks, the history of people working together, and all the vision and ideas that are latent in the community. Latent meaning just sitting there waiting to be accessed, waiting to be utilized, waiting to be energized. And my friends, this is like the most powerful part of CCD, to it's a blessing for us actually to go in there as a facilitator and be witness to this process, and to see God shining on a community and recognizing all of the assets and the things that are there is a wonderful experience to be a part of. And so you're going in there as an investigator, asking questions, connecting the dots. You're gathering information, you're taking an inventory of what's there, reflecting on what are the possibilities, not rushing through a process, but taking the time to really investigate and recognize what's there. And then we move on to connect. I always think about the discovery process as piling assets up on the table, like a banquet. And there's so much to choose from, and all this amazing food that you can eat. And now the next part of it is to make connections between them. You're connecting gifts and assets together, the people, the materials. And sometimes when we do the facilitation training, we use this analogy of Lego, the little building blocks that you put together. We'll give people 3 or 4 pieces of Lego and say, hey, can you make something amazing? Make a car, make a boat, make a house. And it's laughable. It's impossible because you just have so very few assets. But then you allow people to combine their building blocks together and amazing things happen. You can make all kinds of things. And so that is what Connect is all about. And so we're going to give you particular exercises and ideas and conversation starters. And so that's what the facilitation process is. How do you practically bring people together to sit around and come up with ideas to bring those assets together? And I will tell you this, is that when you go through an extended discovery process together, it's like picking low-hanging fruit, because it's right there in front of you. In fact, the question then becomes, how have we not already been doing that? Or this, you guys, in this community, because it's right there in front of us. And so that's the beauty of what happens if we take our time in this process to shine the light on what assets are there. And so connecting is not just about connecting all the assets together, but it's also about connecting assets to opportunities. Thirdly, we come to mobilization. All of these ideas, how does the community move forward? How do we organize ourselves, and how do we plan together to move forward and sort of iterate a process? And so that's something that you can help guide the community through as well as a facilitator. In terms of timing, like sometimes people say, how long does this process take? Well, it's not a regimented approach. It's not hey, we're going to do a 3-day training course, we're going to do a 3-month training course. It could be 3 years. There's so many different ways that you could approach this, and really it's up to you to say, okay, here's this amazing content, right? Like it's like a toolbox, right? This toolbox of content that we're going to give you. And just like a mechanic has a toolbox of things. Well, then they come to a house to fix some plumbing, or they go to at the garage they're going to fix a car or whatever. They're thinking, okay, well, what tools do I use? How do we use them? How long is this going to take? And so really it's up to you to determine what's the best way to engage this community. How many times should we come in there? And that's the role of the facilitator, really, because you're empowering a process that is really centered on the community itself. The power comes from the community itself. And that's where my metaphor of the mechanic kind of lacks, because you're not a fixer of problems, but you're recognizing the power that's already there. I want to turn your attention to one more thing, and then I'm going to hand it over to Daniela. Sorry, I'm a little late on my slides, but this is the Discover, Connect, and Mobilize. And Daniela and Kendra are going to take you through that some more. There's a great metaphor that comes from David Ehrlichman, who wrote the book Social Networks. Sorry, Impact Networks. Here it is right here. I highly recommend this book, Impact Networks. We were talking about the power of social movements. And in it, he makes a comparison between a machine and a garden. Most organizations approach community development like they're operating a machine. If you put in the right inputs, you're going to get the right outputs, and given the right organizational process, you're going to make the impact that you want. It's a very straight line, and it's really modern kind of scientific approach to development, right? And so that's sort of the machine oriented approach to it. And sometimes it works, but from a community-centered development process, it can be problematic. And so he offers a different approach, and he talks about the garden. And I want to just kind of walk you through this and kind of compare them a little bit, because when you're working with the community and facilitating a process that's empowered from the inside out, it's not something that you build at all, but it's something that you cultivate. And cultivate is such a great word to think about how you work with the community. You actually don't have a lot of control over the outcome. So let's be realistic. We're not building machines that we have control over the process. We're not engineers, we're not scientists. And if we think that we are, we're going to be disappointed with the results, because communities don't operate that way. You prepare the soil, you water it, you nurture it, you do what you can as a facilitator, and it has the potential to grow and grow and grow. So you can see here with the machine, it's something that you build, right? You find the staff, you raise the money, you get the materials. But cultivating is not carrying out a process, but cultivating relationships, right? You're focusing on leaders, engaging the whole community. You're focused around values. You're finding collaboration. It's something that actually takes a long time, so it's slow. You can't rush it. You prepare the soil, and you actually just have to wait. There's a lot of waiting involved, allowing seeds to germinate, allowing nature to take its course. And whereas a machine, the process is quick, it's built to exact specifications. Whereas the garden is variable. It's really uncertain how the garden will grow and where the seeds will multiply. Here's an interesting thing about a machine is that given enough time, what's going to happen to the machine? It's going to start to break down. You're going to need to maintain it. Eventually, just like every machine that's ever existed, it's going to die. But a garden's different, isn't it? Given enough time, it's going to multiply. It's going to produce. I remember living in Thailand, where I returned home to Canada for about 2 weeks one time, and I went back, and man, I had a 3-day job just taming my back garden, because without me there, it had completely taken over the yard. And I just think about that in terms of the communities that we work with. When we walk away, if we've tended to that garden, facilitated that early process to let that internal organic growth happen, then it's this wow factor where it multiplies on its own. And that's the beauty of the garden metaphor. And so growth of a machine really depends on an expert, depends on outside funding. How do we have growth that happens in a garden? Well, it depends on pollinators. It depends on bees. And you just think about that. If you just picture this garden and just looking out and seeing these bees that are moving and pollinating from flower to flower in your garden, right? Like you can't control that. You can create an environment where that happens, but that growth is really dependent on that. So actually think about those bees as people in the community, and they're moving from house to house and person to person, sharing ideas, sharing passion. What a beautiful image of what that community interaction and environment can look like. Where does the fuel come from? Well, with the garden, it's an internal fuel, right? It's actually the DNA. Now, this is getting back to our principles, the organic principle. There's a DNA inside of the seed that's going to has this predictive growth of what's going to happen, and the power as well comes from the seed. Whereas in a machine, you have to continually pour gas into the engine to make it go. And so, what a beautiful thing to recognize that we don't actually need to add anything in terms of fuel. It's already there. We just facilitate and manage and steward this growth process that God has given us. And so it's not a deliberate planning. And this is the tricky part as leaders, because we want to be organized, we want to be deliberate, we want to manage a process. But sometimes good stewardship calls us to take our hands off, be flexible, be adaptive, recognize that things are going to change and we need to shift and adapt with it. And so ultimately, this is about a process, but it's not outcome oriented. A machine is all about what do we want this machine to spit out in the end, and that's what everything is driven towards. It's about what is the outcome. And what we're doing as a gardener is we're driven by the values. We're driven by the principles of what is going to make growth happen. If we really focus our attention and lean into the principles that guide us, we're driven by values and principles. So I'm going to hand it over to Daniela, and she's going to just sink into that idea a little bit more about the values-oriented process.
Right. If we truly want to operate like a garden, as Jamie was saying, we want to be process oriented as opposed to outcome oriented. And just to give you a little example of what I mean by that, I want to use the metaphor of art therapy as an example of working with this values oriented process rather than a result and outcome oriented process. So I was reading about the art therapy in the Canadian Art Therapy Association. This is how it describes art therapy. It says that it's combining the creative process for things like painting, sculpting, pottery, other processes like that to do with art, with psychotherapy. So it is facilitating a self-exploration and understanding using things like imagery, color, and shape as part of the creative therapeutic process. So what is the point of doing art therapy? What is the process unto? Are we focusing on transformation of a canvas or a piece of art? Or are we focusing on the transformation of the actual artist? In an outcome-oriented process, we would be placing our attention on the results, the art, how good it looks, how well it turned out, all those kinds of things. But in a values-oriented process, we would be placing our attention on the transformation of the artist as they explored themselves as artists, as they began their understanding of who they are through the creative process. We would be focusing more on things like engaging the mind, the body, and the spirit of the artist in ways that are different from just spoken words. So the process itself, it's like turning on a light for the person, on the person who's going through the art therapy. They're able to sense, they're able to perceive and understand in new ways. They're able to express themselves in new ways. The artist is actually being changed and transformed as they go through this creative art process. Now, think about how this could be applied to community work. In an outcome-driven process, we would be placing our attention on the results. Things like how much medicine we distributed, what our farm project produces, or how are we going to relieve an approaching pandemic. So the process becomes all about then efficiency, speed, problem solving, independence. Alternatively, in a values-driven process, we're actually focusing or illuminating on the community who's being changed. We're focusing on the principles being produced. Things like that we talked about in our last course, things like ownership, wholeness, positivity, relationality, and so on. So the process becomes all about actually moving at the speed of trust. It becomes about inquiry and curiosity and interdependence. So we believe that walking through the overlapping phases of discover, connect, mobilize does just this. We're focusing on the process, illuminating on the community that's going through that process. And as we place our attention on the values of the process, it's actually in the process itself that the community is changed and transformed, and transformation truly happens. And guess what? This is the best part. If you take care of the process, you will get the results. It's kind of like a win-win approach. And Jamie's going to talk a little bit more about this benefit kind of doing the process-oriented approach. Oh, you're on mute, bud. I can take over until you get it figured out. Yeah. So there isn't really anything wrong with the process. Actually, gardeners need to be very organized in their approach to managing their garden. But they know ultimately that the garden has a life of its own. It's different than that of an engineer or a scientist, like Jamie was talking before with the machine versus garden, who wants to control every aspect of the process so that they achieve the outcome that they're after. Now, so in this course, we're actually going to lead you through a process, which you will then facilitate with your community. But the important thing to remember is that this process is driven by and dependent on values and not the outcomes. So when you think about working in this way, you can start to visualize what kind of community-centered benefits are produced. Things like collaboration and mutuality within the community are built. And this social capital ultimately will increase community resilience and functionality. It also results in greater inclusivity because people of all walks of life are actually given the agency individually and collectively and the ownership to make an impact in their community. It produces things like when you go through a process and you're given a little bit more freedom and wonder and curiosity, well, you're going to be more creative as a group. You're going to be more innovative. You're going to be better at problem solving. It's like it's squeezing out the best of everybody who's involved when all of their assets are being used. The community then, out of that, learns more about itself. They're creating their identity. They're recognizing their history, their strengths, and their unique characteristics. And so what's so beautiful is that the outcomes are actually 100% more community relevant because of the process. And things are much more achievable because they're chosen and evolve in a more natural, collaborative, and organic way. So if we believe in these principles and in this theory of change, and we've kind of internalized it all, it's safe to embark on this change process. And so I'm going to take you to the first part of the process that we talk about, and we call it discover. And as mentioned earlier, the first phase of the CCD process is this discovery. It's the starting point. And its purpose is to allow communities to focus their attention on, we've all talked about that cup half full. We're focusing our attention. We're putting the light on the cup half full in our community. And in this phase, communities will unearth the treasures within their community. It's a time of investigating, gathering, reflecting on the strengths, talents, passions, and assets of a community. So this is really the concrete, tangible part of the CCD process. And we're going to be spending the first half of this year on this part of the practicum, so about 6 months, so that we can just pile up all of the assets, strengths, talents, passions of the community. And in our last course, we talked about laying a solid foundation for our community. The foundation centered on the CCD principles. So now we're going to start building on top of that foundation as we go along in the discover phase. What are the materials, though, that we're going to be building with? What's coming on top of this foundation? We want to ask ourselves, are we going to build out of a poverty of being, or are we going to be building out of a mindset of abundance? What do we have? And that's what this discover process is all about. Rather than looking at deliverables and outputs, which serve the deficiencies of our community, we're going to be building with something called discoverables. And this is like the treasures that we're finding within our community that we're allowing to build out of this abundance. So I'm guessing that you are very excited to build with discoverables. And you're asking yourself, what are these discoverables? And so we would like to share with you 7 which CCD practitioners are unearthing in their communities. So I'm just going to introduce them to you today, but in the 6 months to come, we're going to take a deeper look into the tools that you can use to engage your community and to facilitate the discovery of each one of them. So the first one, the first discoverable, is stories. Kind of goes with the organic principle. This is a time to gather stories of old. So in this part, we're going to be locating and celebrating the functional aspects or the things that are already working in our community. We're going to be discovering the history of who we are, histories of resilience, histories of creativity. So it's a time for the community to recognize its unique personality and identity and to rediscover what we are capable of. So the second discoverable we call individual capacities. This discoverable is about unearthing the gifts, the passions, strengths, and talents of each individual community member. So each community member will be guided through a process of discovering their own unique and individual gifts. Oftentimes, people don't realize the gifts that they actually have, or they think that they don't have anything. So this is a special time for you as facilitators to help people to actually realize, wow, I have something to offer. Gifts of my head, gifts of my heart, gifts of my hands, heels, my social interactions. And I start to shift from a mindset of deficiency to abundance. So that's what that one's all about. The third one is community capacities. So like I mentioned before, all of these discoverables are kind of about building upon each other. They're building upon the last one. So like the individual capacities, the assets that we hold as a community, they're not though individual. Yes, we each have gifts and passions, but they're not just isolated or separated from each other. They were meant to be connected and build off of one another. So this discoverable allows community members to discover their collective or common gifts and passions and strengths and talents as a community. So they'll be facilitated through a series of engagement tools that will help them to recognize themes of capacities within their community. The fourth discoverable is associations. So in most communities, we actually find groups of people that are already working together for a common purpose. They're like volunteers, connected and cooperating with one another, usually in smaller groups, working face to face. They're not always formal, often actually they're informal, and they're things like block clubs or even book clubs. They could be veterans organizations, gardening clubs, maybe more highly formal advocacy groups. So mapping associations is so important because it helps us to recognize what's already happening in the community and where different groups could actually potentially join their gifts together for a common purpose. Instead of just being silos doing their own thing, what if they could come together for common things in the community? The fifth one is institutions. So institutions are defined as groups of paid people in more formal hierarchical organizations, and they come in three different forms: for profit, not for profit, and governmental. Now, when used appropriately, local institutions, whether they be public, private, charitable, religious, can actually offer the necessary support and functionality to community-driven initiatives. Sometimes institutions are thought of in a negative way or like as barriers, but in fact, institutions are not bad. We just need to recognize what their appropriate function is and understand that they cannot on their own create a healthy and happy society. We can actually, though, come together and work together, and they can be assets to our community in our initiatives. So sixth, the next discoverable is physical places and spaces. I love this one. Have you ever walked through your community with a particular purpose and realized that you've missed so many things that exist around you? I remember going for a walk with my son with the purpose of teaching him different names of flowers, but it actually caused me to recognize the beauty of my neighborhood, the unique styles of the various households, and the efforts and passions of my neighbors. What if we did this in our community in a bigger way? What if we mapped the physical spaces and places of our community with the purpose of unearthing the assets and strengths and action in our community? That's what that discoverable is all about. And the last one is called exchange. This one's a little bit more tricky, but we will get deeper into it when we get to that section. But exchange is all about discovering the different forms of capital that we have as a community, things like human capital, natural, social, political, cultural, even spiritual, all of the different forms of capital we have and we hold as a community, and then be able to see the potential of how that capital could be exchanged with one another in a gift economy. With this spirit of generosity and mutuality, we can fulfill various community functions without always having to rely on financial resources. So, like mentioned earlier, we may spend a longer time on this discover phase in this training, but it's actually the connect and mobilize phase that take the longest time in reality if done right. So I'm going to let Kendra take you through the connect and mobilize.
Thanks, Daniela. As Daniela said, the process she just described will be the first 6 months. It's the first phase of this practicum. There are 2 other phases, like she said, the connect and mobilize phase. And I'm just going to give you a sneak peek of those phases. When we get to them, we'll do a deep dive about what these phases entail. So the connect phase is the second phase of the community center development process. And it's all about activating and connecting all of those great assets that you just discovered in the 6-month discovery process. It's about making those connections and multiplying their value and benefit by that same concept that Jamie talked about, the pollinating idea, that we can see these assets grow in their value when they're connected meaningfully within the community. The connect phase has 2 key aspects. One is making an inventory of what you have, recognizing those shared strengths, shared assets, shared experiences. And it's about seeing all of those assets that God has put in your hands and looking for creative ways to make connections, which multiplies their values and effectiveness. Jamie is going to share a story to illustrate what this means in a minute. And then there's another aspect, and it's about coming to a consensus with your team about your themes of calling. What are you called to as a team in terms of making positive change in your community? There is a tangible and concrete aspect to this phase, which is connecting those strengths and passions and assets to opportunities. And there's an intangible or abstract asset to this phase, creating a connecting culture in your community. This phase includes a couple of modules. We'll be looking more deeply at things like identifying connectors and differentiating between leaders within our communities. We'll be looking at creating spaces for connection within your communities, and establishing consensus. We'll talk about how to do that, how to make decisions together as a team. And we'll also talk about how to deal with conflict that comes up often in the community-centered development process. So we'll give you guys some tools about how to do that as well in the connect phase. The connect phase is all about, it's a push rather than a pull, right? It's motivating. It leads our communities to making meaningful impact. The second phase is the third phase, excuse me, is the mobilize phase. So the definition of mobilize is referring to the distribution of resources, gifts, strengths, assets for purposeful action to achieve a specific goal. This phase is all about activation. It is the momentum principle in action. This phase represents the culmination of the community-centered development process. It's activating hope, imagination, fire, and passion in our community to make positive change. It's the doing of the process. It's about activating internal motivation. People believe they can make a difference, and so they do with what they have. So the same activation that we receive as community-centered development facilitators, we pass that on to our community, and they activate and they make change. And then we see a ripple effect within the communities doing the CCD process. It's beautiful. Okay, the final phase looks at these three things and a couple more things as well. It looks at what's the low-hanging fruit? What's the best next step or the right next step? How can we do something that will be successful? It's about goal setting and activating movement and momentum within our communities. Jamie is going to share a story that illustrates this whole process in action. So I'll pass it over to Jamie for the story.
Sorry, did you transition to me?
Yes, the Kenge story.
Sorry, guys, I'm having oh, nice, Daniela. Thanks for that celebratory thumbs up. Sorry, I'm having some technical issues, as you can tell by my changing headphones every 3 minutes. But I want to tell you the story. Okay, so Kenge in Africa is an interesting story about mobilization because it really keys in on these ideas that Kendra just shared about low-hanging fruit and next right step. And if you start with this mentality of let's do something enormous, really big outcome oriented, yeah, you may be setting yourself up for failure. And so this story of a small community in rural Congo, so, very poor, vulnerable community. There's a church community with a few hundred people. And the first thing they said, what can we actually do? They decided to do this sort of beautification process where they said, let's recognize what God has given us with this church building and let's clean it up. And so the community came together and they did this cleaning, they did some painting. And what's so important about that is that the goal itself is actually collaboration and creating linkages between people, just really activating people and all phases, all levels of people throughout the congregation. And then from there, they went on to a bit more of a challenging project, which was to fix and repair the roof and some leaks in the roof and things like that. And so as they went along, they kept getting more and more challenging projects that they were doing. And ultimately, they looked at some of the assets that they had. In their congregation, they had some trained nurses. And along with that, they had some medical supplies that they had brought with them, some stethoscopes. And they also knew that they had a building, and it was a building that they had used as a guest house. So when people come to visit the church, they thought, well, maybe it'd be better utilized for a health clinic. And so they took all of these assets. They recognized that if we compile them together, there's an opportunity here. And so they started this health clinic. And I actually went to visit it. That's why I love this story so much, because I was there at this health clinic and just seeing the passion that went into this. You know, this was not a government-oriented, constructed health clinic. This was done by the community itself. Many volunteers were a part of it. They're creating a little bit of income, and they're, more importantly, they're keeping the health clinic active and going, so the community was blessed through it. And it was so successful, they eventually attracted funds from the outside. They're able to enlarge the health clinic, actually move to a new building. And sometimes we talk about bonding and bridging in our CCD training. And so we start with the importance of bonding together. And as we do that, we build social capital, we create opportunities, we eventually can make bridges into outside opportunities. So often we want to start with the bridging. Oh, what is out there? What can we access? What funding and what expertise from that's external to us can we access, instead of starting with the bonding and then see how that naturally create bridges of opportunity. So it's just a little story about mobilization. I want to just shift, and we're going to kind of move into landing the plane here, just talking about the role of the facilitator. And the most important thing I want you to understand is that there's nothing difficult or intimidating about leading a CCD process. And sometimes people are resistant to working with the community because they feel the burden to bring the knowledge and the expertise and the leadership to be a problem solver. But the beauty of CCD is that all of the knowledge, the vision, the planning, and the energy come from within the community itself. So as a facilitator, you can relax and you know, just look out at the garden and, you know, see what's happening, and expect that the rain and the sun, the pollinators, the bees, all of the natural processes in the community, fertilization, germinating plants, organic growth that happens from the DNA, that's all going to happen. And so you need to, that's why that garden metaphor is so great to reflect on as a facilitator. So now your job is sort of to till the earth, prune some branches, but recognize you have no power to make things grow. And that's very liberating in order to facilitate in that way. Now, that is not to say that facilitation is easy, but it's a different mentality that you have to take on. And you're going to discover there is an art to it, but a starting point is to know that you don't have to teach, and you don't have to have a bunch of knowledge or background information or even experience in a particular sector. And you don't even need to guide people necessarily. In fact, if you do take on too much of a role of the change maker and the community guide, you can become an obstacle in the process, because you can be getting in the way of a healthy process if you're not careful as a facilitator. Because if the community sees you as a problem solver, they're not going to see solutions. If they see you as the solution, if they see you as a key leader, local leaders will not step up. So what does a facilitator do? The role is really different from that of a trainer. And sometimes we're more familiar with that kind of language around going in and training and pulling the strings and making things happen. And so you're a combination of things: a catalyst, a connector, a unifier, a coach. And I just want to mention a few things. It just came to my mind, and we're actually going to send out a handout as well, because I'd like you to read some more on this really unique role of what a facilitator is. It's unique and different. And so a few things I would say. Number one, work from the shadows. And so just think about that. You're in the shadows. You're not there to be seen necessarily. In fact, to push out others into the spotlight, to push their ideas into the spotlight, and to bring confidence to them, to recognize their talents, that they can, do it themselves. Working with humility and sort of recognizing that gardener role, that it's all happening. All the power for change is there. And so we take this really humble approach to not being the change agent, and be a detective. So you're kind of, this is a fun part of it, actually, looking to unlock some of the mysteries and the potentials with the community. And so it really has to take time to investigate and to come up with information. Bestow confidence. And often people come into this discovery process with a lot of hesitation, with a lot of doubt. Number one, because it's a different approach to doing development. And at some level, it seems like it's not really that effective. What do you mean? We're going to just sit around and talk about what we have? Well, we're poor, we're vulnerable, we don't have a lot. Why would we start there? It doesn't make sense. And so it's important for you to come in with confidence, knowing that the values-oriented process will always work. We will always work. It may not work in the way that you expect. It may not spit out the outcomes that you would expect from a machine to spit out. But if we start with values, if we begin with the principles will always work. Gravity as a scientific principle will always work. It's not going to turn off for, parts of the day or anything. You can always depend on it. And so if we focus on those principles, you can have confidence that as you work with the community, there's going to be some outcomes that are going to be beneficial for this community. Embrace thinking over learning. And so you have to be able to hold dynamic tensions. There's going to be tensions. There's going to be uncertainty. Things are not going to move quickly. And so you have to be able to sit and be in that thinking part of the process. That's not all about, what did we discern? What did we learn? What did we conclude? Because sometimes we don't come to conclusions right away. And so just holding in that thinking and collaborating space and allowing for new kinds of thoughts to emerge that come from the inside out. And then let the community change you. I love this mentality. What if you go in, and as much as you're trying to facilitate a change process, you're also taking the attitude of a learner? What if you go into a community prepared to be blessed by that community? Because God will do that. I think of Elisha and the story from 2 Kings, where the widow's oil. He goes in and he says to her, she expects him to be a problem solver, and he says, "What do you have?" Can you imagine how blessed he was to be able to watch that process unfold, where the community came together and she was given the oil that was able to solve the problem, getting her son back from captivity? We can be blessed in the same way to be a part of what God is doing, but it takes us, standing back and working from the shadows. So, in conclusion, I'm going to hand it over to Kendra, I believe.
Just kidding. I'll
Sorry,
finish it up.
guys. Technical difficulties here too.
Oh, there you go. Good.
All right, it's such a joy to be together on this process in practice with one another. Welcome to the practicum, friends. We believe this is a sacred calling, right? The Lord is making all things new. We get to join him and participate with that and see our communities transform from the inside out. So we're excited to be on this journey together, and we can't wait to continue together. All right, bless you guys. Thanks.
Thanks, guys. See you soon.
Bye.